Okay, so it's finally time for me to work on this tree. I have a long relationship with this tree. This is a Tohoku Juniper. It's a Yamadori tree. It's collected from the north of Japan, from the Sanrikyu area. And I've known this tree since about 2012, when I first worked on it. What's special about this tree and trees from the Tohoku area is the foliage is quite coarse and less desirable than Itoigawa. So quite often they get grafted over with Itoigawa foliage, which is a much more compact, predictable and usable foliage. But this one was imported into the UK quite a long time ago. It was originally brought into Europe by Danny Yusa, and then came over to John Hamby's, where it was changed hands a few times and ended up with a customer who asked me to help him to sort of style it. The first time I came across the tree, the angle of the trunk was something like this. It was very much kind of like leaning towards the front, which is quite a kind of a common problem that you get with some collected trees if they get planted incorrectly at the first planting. So what we did at the time was to really sort of strap the roots in. I used a bamboo stick on both sides of the root base, tied it in very, very tightly, and then literally just pushed the tree up and braced it with a piece of wood. And over the course of sort of 4 or 5 years, the trunk didn't bend. We weren't bending the trunk, we were just moving the trunk relative to the roots. The tree sort of became a lot more sort of upright, and we're able to sort of see the trunk line a lot more. It hasn't been repotted since that time. When it came to me 6 years ago now, 7, the bamboo bar was still across there. Now the gentleman who had it when I worked on it, he kept it for a couple of years and struggled to do anything with the foliage because the foliage was a lot coarser then. And he moved it on to somebody else, a customer down sort of London area. And he had the same problem, struggled to do anything with it because of the coarse nature of the foliage. And eventually I took it as part exchange for another tree. It was in quite bad shape then. It lost quite a few branches up in the top. And so I basically sort of set about trying to sort of get it back to health, and then sort of see what I was going to do with it. As I said, it's not been repotted in at least 10 years. And this has been done very intentionally. In order to make the foliage compact, one of the things that we have to do is to develop a very, very compact root ball. By developing and slowing down a compact root ball, the top growth becomes very, very compact, extension growth becomes very little each year, and it takes on a different type of character. Now this tree is a challenge in trying to maintain that compact foliage and trying to maintain that character rather than to grow it out rapidly, to rejuvenate everything and to get coarse foliage. And so it's been quite a daunting prospect to actually come along and work on this. This is, you know, working on Itoigawa foliage is easy. I do it on hundreds of trees all the time. But to work on this, to try and maintain the character of the tree, the aged character that I've worked for years to try and develop. And when I say worked, I mean all I've done is just leave the tree to its own devices. Developing the bark character, the natural aged appearance to the Deadwood. This hasn't been lime sulfured in as long as I've had it. There's been nothing done to this tree, it's just been left to naturally mature. So what I need to do now, what I've been putting off for at least 1.5 years, is to come in and now style this tree and keep that character. So over the last couple of years I've been considering and contemplating the design of this tree, thinking about its good points and its bad points and where I like to sort of take it in the future. One thing that had always kind of irritated me about the tree is the fact that all of the branches come basically from this top section here. There's a big branch that gets bent down, comes down, touches the trunk here, splits into two. One section comes here, then the other section comes down and then around here. That's not necessarily a bad thing for a juniper. A lot of trees are quite often made from just one single branch bent around, and then secondary branches bent up to make other foliage pads and such like. So it's not necessarily a negative thing, but it feels very heavy. It feels like it's covering the best character feature, which is this shari here, this plank-like, this wave-like shari, the deadwood that we have here. Now all of this is covering that area. Originally I'd thought about potentially taking the entire branch off and just working with what we have up at the top, making a very sort of literati style tree. But then thinking about the foliage, the sudden removal of 2/3 of the foliage of this tree will result in rejuvenation. It will result in the foliage that remains on the tree growing rapidly, becoming coarser again. And so that's one reason for not wanting to do it. But also, it may just look very, very sparse. So what we're going to do, first off, is to take this branch off so we can see that lower section and give the tree then a much more definite direction across here. A few years ago, I worked at lifting the apex and bringing it slightly across towards the center of the tree, and I've allowed this branch just to grow rapidly out, okay, with the intention of trying to bring the center of gravity of the apex, the direction of the apex, to flow in this direction. Okay, so I've considered the removal of this branch for many months, a long time. I've covered it, I've uncovered it, and it's finally time to get rid of it. So the removal of that branch has opened up this section of the tree a lot more now. Just made a very short jin temporarily out of the stub that's left. Now, having removed that branch, the dynamic of the tree has changed completely. And now this branch is the lowest point on the tree. If we want to make the tree flow into here, then what we're going to need to do is reduce this branch back. Not remove it entirely, because then we'll have no branch at the back of the composition in order to stop the eye and give no depth and perspective. We're going to need to reduce it back so that the eye flows into here and not down there. So the next job now is to clean up the foliage. Now this is a male tree, and it flowers some years a lot worse than others. But where a pollen cone has formed and then fallen off, we end up with the growth tip of that piece of foliage disappearing. And there's quite a lot of those bits of foliage on the inside of the tree. Now what we're going to look at doing is cleaning off some, but not all of them. One of the things we want to try and keep with this tree is that feeling of naturalness, that feeling of age. And to clean all of those off would make it look perhaps a little bit too artificial. So we're going to have to try and find that fine line between it looking untidy, between it looking dirty, and going too far, cleaning it too much, and making it look artificial. So what we'll start with is the real obvious weak branches, the weaker foliage, the downward growing foliage, and areas where it's very dense with those growth tips that have disappeared. So now we've finished cleaning out over the whole tree, just the most obvious unnecessary foliage, the stuff on the inside that was inefficient, that had lost its tips. Left quite a bit on in certain places to try and keep that natural look, but some more might be removed in the future. What we're going to start to do now is we're going to wire this lower branch, start with these lower branches and get those into position, and sort of begin to work our way up, and then look at what we're going to do with the apex last. So what we're trying to do with the wire is to use the minimum amount of wire to get the maximum effect. The more wire that goes on, the more it looks as though it's been touched, the more artificial the feel will be. And so to try to keep that natural feel, I have to use as little as possible. Using no wire, and the tree is going to grow in undesirable directions, and it's not going to maximise the character in the way that I want it to. So we have to use some wire in order to position desirable branches in certain ways. Each wire that I put on, each branch that I'm looking at, I have to look at it and think, is that branch sitting in a position where it looks natural and looks as though it should be there? Is it hanging in a nice attractive way, or can I improve that? Can I make it healthier? Can I make it better positioned aesthetically by applying some wire? So this branch at the back here, for example, previously been wired and pruned and cut and styled, and the way that it's sitting now is exactly how I want it to be. I can't improve that anymore. I can make it look tidier, I can make it look cleaner, but I don't want it to look any cleaner. We have a lovely line of the branch coming down, branches coming up, coming downwards off of it, dangling, slightly weaker. This is exactly how that branch would be in nature. It's not flowing off too far, the branch line isn't too strong, it's just right for that space. And so I can't improve it with wire. This branch here was just opened out, maximised. This branch just dropped down a little to separate it from those, just so we can maximise the volume there. Just one wire to open it out. So each branch is approached with the idea of, does it need wire? There's going to be another branch up here. I'm just going to leave it unwired because the natural character of it cannot be improved upon. Position is perfect, so I don't need to wire it. And then with the branches that are wired, we're going to look to replicate that feel. And this tree will only be at its best when that wire has done its job and is taken off, and then the branches have matured into that position. So the final major question we have to resolve with the branches and the wiring is this area up here. Got one very long, strong shoot which is going here, making this area really quite heavy. Had considered removing it, but then that area is going to be quite empty. There'll be a disconnect between the lower section and the apex. Also make this whole area in here very exposed until weaker branches and shoots grow to fill in. So I've been kicking the problem down the road, but now I've got to face it. I think if we use that branch and bring it in, it's going to end up being denser than other places. So first thing I'm going to do is take off that long shoot down to this secondary, and then try positioning some of the branches. Okay, so we've basically kind of reached the point where I have wired everything that I think needs to be wired at the moment. One of the biggest challenges has been to resist the urge to wire everything and to resist the urge to clean everything completely. To try and keep that natural look about things, to allow the branches to sit how they naturally are in places, as long as they're not completely out of shape, as long as they're not filling spaces which we want to try and create, so that we get a flow through the composition and we get to glimpse branches where we want to show them, see the deadwood where we want to show, or hide areas that we want to hide. As long as the foliage is sitting nice and naturally, try to keep it unwired. But at the same time, wiring the things that have to be wired in order to position them so that all of those features are shown off to their best, so that we have something which is coherent and moves in a certain direction. Okay. So the only other thing to do now really is to look at the trunk, the deadwood, and this freshly created gin. So one of the things that I've been looking at developing over the years is this flaky bark on the trunk, this sign of age coming up. Now you notice the more exposed the bark is, the flakier it is. Coming up into the top, this younger sort of area is much less flaky. There's a much more sort of youthful age to that. Now this is what we're trying to achieve. This is what I'm trying to avoid. Okay, so there's a definite difference between the deadwood and the livewood. So I don't need to change that. I don't need to strip all of this flaky bark back to the red, youthful looking trunk underneath in order to get that difference, to get that separation. What we do need to ensure, however, is that the deadwood looks clean and there are no patches of green or anywhere there's sort of water's collected and it's become discoloured. Other than that, it has signs of natural age. It looks as though it would do in the wild. It has character with texture, with variations. We don't want it just to be all this one monochromatic colour without any texture. And so it's going to be left as close to that as possible. It's like a lot of the imperfections in this tree now are deliberate imperfections. And so that makes it artificial, just as artificial as something that is made perfect. You know, when you're deliberately leaving it a little bit untidy, there's always that kind of like, you can still see it. So we've done minimal cleaning on the Deadwood to try and keep that character, to keep those textures, to keep the natural appearance to it, and definitely to keep all the flaky bark. Just cleaned any of the dirty areas. Now the question is what to do with this gin. Okay, it was left long when I cut that branch off. Now there's a clear contrast between this fresh wood, which is still very, very sappy and very, very wet, and the aged deadwood, the age of the trunk. But all of this deadwood was at one point that young. All of these gins were at some point as fresh as this. So if this, from a positional point, from a composition point, is something that we wish to keep, then we can make it look as old as we can by tearing, opening it up, exposing the fibres, and then waiting for it to dry out and to look as old and as aged as the rest of the tree. So it looks strange now, but the question you have to ask yourself is it strange because of the position or because of the age? If it's a question of age, all we have to do is wait. However, in this case, looking at this gin here, the position is poor, the direction is poor. The reason for wanting to remove all of that foliage that was down there was to help bring the eye up and down into that branch. Having a very sort of strong contrasting movement there is not helping. And also, this branch at the back, the character of this branch is something that I wish to highlight. It's quite a weak looking branch, a bit saggy, but there's lovely natural taper, changes of direction, bifurcation. The structure of this branch is beautiful. This is, for me, is one of the key branches on the tree. And so having a big gin in front of it is not going to help. Having this gin coming up close to the trunk will do. So we're going to remove this and keep that one. So with the removal of that gin, this branch now comes to life, as does this space. So it wasn't the age that was the problem with that gin, but the position. So I'm going to call it a day today. Working on this tree has been very much an exercise in restraint. Trying to stop myself from wiring branches that didn't need wiring just for the sake of it. Trying to stop myself from making clean and definite lines. Trying to stop myself from falling into patterns when working on the foliage pads. Trying to have a variety in densities to try and keep the weakness of this branch as a character feature. There's a definite difference between the strong apex and these weaker lower branches. And one thing I've been thinking about and sort of exploring a little bit recently over this last year is the idea that we need to have everything on the tree as strong as possible. When walking out in nature, we see trees with weak branches on the inside and lower branches that dangle down naturally, that are weak, and yet that isn't represented in bonsai. When we look at Deadwood and live vein creation in the conventional sort of bonsai aesthetic, we see these black and white or red and white. It's either one thing or the other, it's a binary choice. And we miss out on these differences, the grey areas in between, the different textures, the different colours. The difference between life and death isn't just you're either alive or you're dead. There are strong areas and there are weak areas. And so looking at trying to capture those within the tree is something I've been thinking about and doing with some of my other trees, and something I've been trying to achieve with this tree. So not shying away from some of the weaker areas, trying to represent them in a natural way is something that I'm going to continue to try and do with this tree. Now, from where we started to where we've come now, there's been quite a lot of foliage have been removed, and what we may see is an increase in vigour in the rest of the tree, and potentially an increase in the sort of the foliage size. I've got to try and keep this in the same pot for as long as I possibly can. Still growing well, water is still able to penetrate into the pot, so there's no immediate need to repot it. I'm going to restrict the fertiliser that's given to this tree, just enough to keep it healthy and happy, but not enough to force it to grow. And what we're going to continue to try and do is develop that mochikomi feel. Now, this mochikomi feel is the character that a tree takes on when it has been grown in a pot and restricted for many, many years. That's an aesthetic that I particularly enjoy. It's something that I try to achieve in my trees. And it's one which requires restraint. Restraint in water, restraint in fertiliser, restraint in how we work the tree. Okay? And that restraint is also to do with the self. Stopping yourself from imposing your own desire for order and cleanliness onto a tree. Restraining the ego. Now, clearly we're making a video, which is quite a narcissistic thing to do. So talking about restraining the ego on a video is slightly contradictory. But that's what we have to try and do. Try and think about how to achieve a certain character and what must be done and what must not be done. Now, leaving a tree to its own devices, things will grow in undesirable directions. So a complete laissez-faire attitude is not appropriate. Working on it too much stinks of humanity, stinks of the hand of man. And so it's about finding that correct balance. Now, this tree has tips at this stage in time towards that we can see that it's been worked on. So what now has to happen is over the next couple of years it has to mature into this shape. Areas that need to fill out need to just dense up, and we need to allow the edges of the foliage pads just to blur a little. Now, trying to style a tree like this, where we're looking at creating definition but then allowing it to mature and for those lines to blur, is like drawing a picture with charcoal and then rubbing the edges so it becomes slightly smudged around the edges. First you have to draw the picture nice and cleanly, but then you smudge the edges, and in the case of bonsai that's allowing it to grow, to mature into that shape. We've come back towards that slightly clean image, but what I have kept is the sense of age on the branches. We have lichen growing on the branches, we have a sense of maturity in the foliage. Try to keep that as much as possible, but just redefine the shape. The one thing that hasn't been discussed is the front of the tree. There's no markers put in the pot to define the front. One thing I do like to try and do is to make the tree look good from as many angles as possible. Try to create a branching structure where, as the tree grows and matures, evolves over time, it can be looked at from various different positions. And so being affixed to one specific front is something that I don't like, and so that's why I've shied away from putting a marker in. Well, I hope that you've gained something from this video. Rather than this being a tutorial on how to wire, how to position branches and things like that, it's more of a looking at how to style a tree from an underlying aesthetic perspective, that being looking to maintain, promote the age and that kind of special character that trees develop from being kept in a pot, and how we keep that. It's also been a challenge for me. It's something that I've been considering for many months. Hopefully I've done the tree justice and that it's going to mature into something close to what it was before in terms of character, but with a much better, clearer defined shape. So everybody's own personal preferences, tastes and interpretations of bonsai is different. This has been an exploration of mine, and I hope that's been useful for you.